Blog Talk Radio.
You are now listening to True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Gacy, Bundy, Dahmer, The Night Stalker, BTK. Every week, another fascinating author talking about the most shocking and infamous killers in true crime history. True Murder, with your host, journalist and author, Dan Zupansky.
Good evening. November 18th, 1978 was a tragically unprecedented day in U.S. history that will forever be woven into the fabric of this country. It is the day that leader of People's Temple, James Warren Jones, ordered the assassination of U.S. Congressman Leo J. and others at the Port Kaituma airstrip in South America, then led his congregation on what Guyana's police chief Skip Roberts testified was a mass suicide. Decades later, however, the depth of this story is still unknown, and many scholars and former members who have continued their exploration of the incident have found that there is still plenty of evidence as well as plenty of sinister connections that contradict the official version of this story. Jonestown, Don't Drink the Kool-Aid, is the chronological story of the rise and fall of People's Temple and its leader Jim Jones, from his early years in Indianapolis and California to the tragic ending in the jungle of South America that claimed the lives of 918 Americans. Jonestown, Don't Drink the Kool-Aid comprehensively details the many links that Jones and his compound had with the CIA and their MKULTRA experiments. Through a comprehensive analysis of Jones' life, People's Temple, and the investigation and the aftermath of the mass murder-suicides, this book is designed to be the quintessential marking piece that will reintroduce this story to society and serve as a reminder of the infamous mantra that hung in the pavilion in Jonestown. Those who forget the past are condemned to repeat it. The book that we're featuring this evening is Jonestown, Don't Drink the Kool-Aid, the complete story behind the mysterious Jim Jones and his exodus to Guyana, with my special guest, journalist and author, Will Savive. Welcome to the program, and thank you for agreeing to this interview. Will Savive.
Hi, Dan. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it. I look forward to this. Absolutely. This is a great show. I love your show.
Thank you very much. This is one of the more incredible moments in American and world history, and if people thought they knew everything about this, this is the book that would tell them otherwise. So let's, again, one of my questions that seems to be important, that's why I always ask it, without giving anything away, how did you come to write this book, Jonestown, Don't Drink the Kool-Aid?
Well, you know, I first started researching the contents and the story, you know, many years ago, probably maybe 15 years ago, before I was a writer. You know, obviously I was, you know, well aware of the story. And when I was in school, I did a book report on it, and I just found that the official version of the story was left a lot to be desired. I did not, you know, I always feel that when you look at something and there are questions, especially, you know, when it comes to news sources or government agencies, that, you know, the mind suddenly tries to, or subconsciously tries to fill those gaps. And I came across a few different writings that kind of opened my eyes a little bit, from Mr. Hogan and John Judge, where they posed the question and actually, you know, put forth some evidence that there might be some CIA connections involved. So I decided to look a little further into the story, and when I began writing, you know, I got my bachelor's degree in criminal justice with a concentration in forensic science, and I began writing these types of stories. This was ideally one of the stories that I wanted to get into a little more. So from there it just kind of steamrolled and snowballed into me writing the story. It wasn't a planned thing from the beginning.
Great. Now let's go back to the beginnings of this incredible story of this man, James Warren Jones, and go back to his parents, Lynetta and James Jones. You take us right back to this, before his birth, before James Warren Jones was born, which was in May 1931. But take us back to his early life and maybe even before Crete, Indiana. So take us back before they settled in this area, and a little bit about Lynetta and James Jones in his early life.
Well, his parents came from right out of the Great Depression, and had, little Jimmy, as I call him in the beginning. They had him, right out of that period. So obviously, you can kind of just tell right from there, what type of people they were. They were survivors. They were struggling just like, everyone else in America, especially in the Dust Bowl area. And, they were scrappers. And James Sr., had some problems and some injuries from, being in the military and on his job. So Lynetta really became the breadwinner in the family, and back in those days, that was a novelty because women were not the breadwinners, so much. So she was very, very tough. She always taught Jimmy to try to be self-sufficient, self-reliant, and it was I believe out of that where he became this person where he took on this persona of being a leader, and she actually pushed him to become a leader instead of a follower, and in essence run businesses on his own instead of working for people. And they were.
Go ahead. Sorry.
No, that's it. I mean, really, that's the essence of I think. What his childhood was about as far as from his parents' perspective.
It's interesting that you write that at that time, and again, they were considered an odd family. The father did a little bit of work, but he had been, like you say, injured in the war from mustard gas, so he did a little bit of work. She really did bring in all the money into the household, but they also they didn't sleep together, the parents. And what I thought was most interesting, too, is that they didn't go to church. They didn't attend church.
Right, and that's another thing from back then that was really odd because, most people were very religious. It's hard, I guess, for a young person to understand that. But, I mean, in America in those days, religion was pervasive, and if you were not into religion, you didn't go to church or you didn't practice in some way, you really were an outcast in the community, in any community you were in.
Now, you talk about in the book, you chronicle that at 4 years old, he meets a pretty important figure, and it's an important story to, again, I guess, explain the early genesis or the early metamorphosis of James Jones. So at 4 years old, you say he meets his friend Donald Friedman, and he also meets this Mrs. Myrtle Kennedy, and she becomes a spiritual advisor. So tell us at 4 years old, again, it's to explain the time, how this woman, what her influence is really on James Jones, and what does his mother have to say? So tell us a little bit about this Mrs. Myrtle Kennedy, his spiritual advisor.
Well, Mrs. Kennedy would kind of took on the role of looking after him because, Jimmy's father was really just kind of indifferent, sick and at the VA hospital a lot, or at the VA spot where, they hung out, and his mother was working. So Jimmy was often seen running around the neighborhood by himself, getting, possibly into trouble, almost getting, hit by a train. And there was a lot of instances where, she would see him and she felt that she would take him under her wing. So she did so, and she happened to be a very religious person, so she also started taking him to church. And from everything I've read, Lynetta was not, particularly happy about it, but she really, had no choice. They were not good friends, her and Mrs. Kennedy, but I'm sure for her son's sake, she appreciated the fact that somebody was, looking after him. And
now,
I believe that she was a good woman, and Lynetta saw that, so she was happy about that at least.
And it's interesting, too, that you talk about the kind of church that he was first exposed to as well, which is a Pentecostal church. And you talk about the word cultish. Even at that time, they were considered a very outside the norm religion as well, weren't they? And some of the things that he got to see at an early age, out of the ordinary.
Absolutely. Well, Mrs. Kennedy wasn't actually happy about that. After a few years, she was actually taking him to, Protestant, and he would go to different churches on his own. He came across that Pentecostal church, which was again on the outskirts, quote unquote, of the area, and really they were looked on as the holy rollers. These people who kind of played fast and loose with religion. That was something he found on his own. And that was the moment that he himself said that, it was there that he felt the most at home. And he said that's where he first experienced real love, as he put it, or his first experiences with love and acceptance. He never felt accepted before he stepped into this world of Pentecostalism.
Interesting, too, you have the female minister at this church really takes him under her wing almost immediately and starts preparing him, recognizing, she said, basically his verbal maturity and his mental superiority, that he was a smart kid. And so she started working with him, and that was something that his mother wasn't too happy with.
Right. Well, even before he had this experience and met these Pentecostal people, he was doing his own preaching in at his house. He would invite his friends over, and he started to cultivate that skill with I'm sure an intrinsic type of charisma that he already possessed. I believe that this female minister, she saw that. And I'm sure you can imagine, this young kid walking in there by himself, which I would assume would be rare, that there weren't many, children that just kind of came in off the street by themselves. And I guess she, again, felt the need to take him under her wing, and maybe even saw this a need and a use for him. And I guess started mentoring him. And yes, Lynetta was certainly not. Well, she didn't really know too much about it until the minister took Jimmy away on a trip, and I guess was filling his head with these paranoid delusions that I guess he portrayed onto his mother and told her about. And I guess at that point, she was not very happy of that type of influence that she was having on him.
Now, amazingly, we're talking about a kid from 10 years old to 12 years old in the time period that we're talking about here. And then at 12 years old, another incident kind of, affects his life too. Again, his friend Don Friedman again, he gets introduced to a BB gun, and the next thing you know, they're introduced to hunting. So him and Don go hunting. So tell us about this story, because obviously it's important in foreshadowing at least, or tell us a little bit about the story about the hunting trip.
Yeah, I think this is where you first start to see, Jimmy's sadistic side, where he points the gun at Don and shoots at him. And it seems to be at this point where he's, starting to kind of test this relationship. This is where in the future we see this is a foreshadowing of every relationship that he'll have in the future, of him testing people, you know, and you know, and showing his domination and his sadistic side, and it's kind of scary when you look back, you know, that this was kind of the beginning of it all, and it seemed to go unchecked. You know, it never seemed to be checked at any point, you know.
In the book, you talk about early influences. He enters high school in 1945, and he gravitates toward the works of Joseph Stalin, Adolf Hitler, Mahatma Gandhi, and Karl Marx. And his IQ is reported at 118, so he's a smart guy.
Right.
So tell us a little bit about high school, and how is he regarded as by other students? I mean, we know this is a time of religiosity, but tell us how does he stick out or fit in?
Well, it seems that he didn't really fit in too well. You know, it was at this point where, you know, when he was younger, he was seen as not really a clean boy. He didn't really care too much about his appearance. Well, this is where he started now to, you know, care about his appearance. Started to do his hair. You know, that was one of his best features, and he you know, he was always combing his hair. And you know, the gym class, he wouldn't participate. He wasn't a very athletic boy, and he was very intelligent, and he would always, at that point, he was starting to, you know, preach to people and to the kids, and I guess that kind of turned them off. And you know, he was trying to, I guess, learn how to manipulate people, and he wasn't really good at it at that point. You know, and that's kind of what I got mostly out of his high school years, that he would get into fights. He was trying to force feed people his beliefs, and I think it was soon after that you know, he really started to get it that you can't do that. You know, you get more, you know, bees with honey than with vinegar.
Now, he was also, at the same time, he was interested in culturally what was going on, which was race relations, and also, interestingly, where he would go out of his norm, out of his neighborhood, or into other communities to preach. He found a big minority population. So tell us how those two things came together and sort of worked for him to formulate an idea of acceptance by an audience.
Right. Well, when he was in his local area, you know, he'd dress up in a robe, and he'd really try to do the fatherly, you know, preaching on the streets, and people just would walk by him and they wouldn't really pay him much mind. And that was a predominantly, you know, white area. And then he took the job in Richmond at the hospital there, and that's when he started preaching in a predominantly black area. And it was there he kind of, that's where he started switching up his style. He would, you know, wear jeans, or he would dress nice, but he wouldn't be so overbearing. And I think that's where he started to learn, you know, that again, the manipulation tactics, you know, that how he was being seen, his self-awareness, I think was growing, and he was coming into his own at that point. But that's where he gained acceptance, and he saw that the black community was, you know, they were more receptive. And he also started listening to a lot of the black preachers of the time, and he saw how their charisma and their excitement were really winning people over. And he started to kind of mix that in a little at this time and adopt those styles. And I think that's, you know, at that point, he was just kind of testing it out, and he was getting, you know, small successes, so he continued to do it.
Now, you were talking about his preaching days in Richmond and where he met Dan Mitrione, and he was a Richmond police officer at that time, and he was a little bit older than Jimmy and kind of took a shining to Jim Jones. And also, just tell us a little bit about his his CIA connections, allegedly, too. So tell us about this introduction, how he met him, and how on earth these two guys become, friendly.
Well, see, we don't have too much information, unfortunately, during that time period of their connection. I mean, Jim talks about it on certain tapes later, but he doesn't go into great detail. But yes, they did have a relationship. It was there that they met. He became police chief, Mitrione. And surely he knew of Jimmy, preaching on those streets, a white boy in a predominantly black neighborhood. So it was there that they met, and there certainly it wasn't an alleged CIA connection. I mean, later on Mitrione became, head of the CIA's torture department over in Brazil, and they actually did a movie about him. He was killed by some guerrillas. There's actually a movie about his life, so that could be easily accessible and researched as well. But they definitely knew each other, and Jim talked about him, and I'm sure we're going to get into what happened in Brazil. I'm sure. I'm assuming that's where you're going with this, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, we'll get there. Sure. Okay.
Go ahead.
Now, so tell us, Jim's parents separate. He's in his last year of high school. Again, you include a story about the last incident or the farewell dinner with his friend Don. And again, this is an important figure in this book. So tell us a little bit about this last meeting and what it really says about Jim Jones.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's funny because, Don they went their separate ways in high school, and Don, was kind of, I guess, with the cool kids. He was playing basketball. He was a jock, and, he liked the ladies, and he was just being a normal teenage boy. Jim was certainly going the opposite way with it. He was kind of a recluse and, doing his own thing. So they kind of separated. They had an incident where they got they got into a fight on the basketball court because Jim was trying to, make them stop playing basketball to read the Bible, which again, at that time, like I said, he was trying to force feed people, which he found later on that it just didn't work. And at that point, they separated for a while, and then they came back together as any friends did. They knew each other since they were little kids. So Jimmy was moving, and so they had this type of kind of farewell dinner. So just to that he was leaving, and he wouldn't let Don leave. There came a time where they were hanging out. He didn't want him to leave, and Don kept saying, "I have to go," and then decided to stay and just kept compromising, and finally, after like an hour of doing this, he finally just said, "Jim, I'm leaving," and got up and just started walking to the door, and I'm sure he knew Jim's sadistic side at this point. I mean, I'm sure he was well aware of it, and he walked fast towards the door. Jimmy grabs his father's shotgun, which his father was sitting in a rocking chair. He grabbed the shotgun, which was behind it. His father, kind of just sitting there listening to the Cincinnati Reds game, he wasn't even paying attention. And, Don started running out the door, and he fired a shot at him that almost hit him and hit the tree. And Don, hid for a couple seconds and then just got up and took off. And Jim was looking for him. And I mean, at this point, obviously this kid was, I'm sure, terrified, and had swore to never speak to Jim again. But obviously a significant moment where we see, this A-type personality, with psychopathic tendencies starting to really take shape.
Continues working at the hospital, and he sort of has seems like an affinity for it, a very much an interest in it. And again, at the hospital, he's working, and he sees his old pal, the guy that should know better. Again, who does he bump into? Tell us again about bumping into Donald Friedman, Sucker for Punishment.
Yeah. So he runs into him again, and at this point, I think he really was starting to become good with his manipulation tactics of people, telling people what they wanted to hear, persuasion techniques. He had started to really develop them very quickly. Once he got this idea and he saw that it worked, he developed them very quickly. He persuaded Don to work at the hospital with him. He said that, he knew Don was really into the ladies at this point. He said there's a lot of beautiful nurses, and somehow he convinced Don to work there. And Don, not knowing, thought that him and Jim were going to be colleagues, but Jim actually wound up being his boss.
Yeah, and riding him pretty good, didn't he? So,
well, he rode him hard. He would play practical jokes on him. He would, at this point, he also learned to find people's weaknesses and exploit them. So he knew Don was kind of a squeamish and afraid of blood. So he'd at times, they worked the night shift. So there would be no one around. So he chased Don around with like a severed arm. He would do. I mean, really, he would do just some really sadistic things. I know I'm kind of laughing at that, but that's really not that funny.
Right. So tell us when Jim Jones meets his wife, under what circumstances, and you can start getting into some of the more profound things that he does with this ability to con and the ability to charm. So tell us a little bit about when this happens. How old is he, and does he meet?
I believe he's around 16 years old, I think. He meets a much older Marceline. I think she was 24. I can't remember offhand, but I mean, so he meets this woman who's significantly older than him, maybe a little younger. She might have been than that, but he starts to now. He charms her. She sees that how great Jim is with the patients. I mean, he really is. He's caring, and it's so hard to think about a person like Jim, who later becomes, or even at this point was sadistic and was doing psychopathic things, but also can show this duality, this heart and a passion for helping people. So this is what makes this so intriguing, that you have this sociopath, psychopath who really knows how to blend in and do these things well. And he won over Marceline, and I guess she reluctantly started a relationship with him, and ultimately they wound up getting married. And again, the parents weren't too happy about it, obviously, but Jim won them over too, with his charm.
Now they were an upper class conservative family too, so he had to be. So he had some overcoming to do with these people. They weren't instantly wanting him. They were a close-knit family, and they were Methodist, so it took some convincing for them to warm up to him, didn't it?
It really is amazing to think how this kid could have even done that. I guess you'd have to really be there to really understand it, which none of us were. But he obviously was very intelligent. He knew how to speak very well. And he again, at this point, I believe he really started to cultivate that master, manipulator, type personality. And at this point, he can manipulate anybody into believing anything that he told them. And I think that he won them over. And this kid had no money. I mean, but I guess they could see at some point, that he's a smart kid. He's going somewhere. But as you see, I mean, it took them a long time. They struggled mightily, and Marceline was the breadwinner for a long time before Jim kind of got on his feet.
Now, again, it's interesting that Jim Jones, this guy that can, as we see, captivates so many people at one time really is in this formative stage where he's learning how to do things. So it takes quite a while. He starts when he's a young man, 10 years old, 12 years old. Still, when he's married to Marceline, he's still honing his craft, isn't he?
Yes, absolutely. I don't even think Marceline knew him too well in the beginning. I would assume he kept a lot of things from her, as far as his personal beliefs and ideologies. But she would soon figure it out. And I guess at that time she was, in love with him and would basically ride with him, no matter what.
Now, soon after they're married, you say that Jim and Marceline, he talks to Marceline about his belief in communism and also about his interest in the struggle for blacks for their equality as well. So tell us a little bit about what he starts to form in his mind about a philosophy that he can use from the pulpit.
Right. I mean, well, he's had these ideologies for a while, and then he tells Marceline this stuff, after they're married. So, he was somehow able to hide a lot of these beliefs from her until I guess he knew he had her at a certain position, and one day it just came out, and then he started taunting her that there was no God there, and the Bible is full of contradictions, and he got her so mad he would taunt her to the point where one day she threw dishes at him and she told him to stop, and she I guess was very angry at him, and I mean that's kind of the person he was. He would just keep poking and prodding until he made you crazy at some point. But obviously, I don't think she was very happy about this, and I guess I don't know how she dealt with it, honestly, because in that day and age, that's a pretty big divide between a wife and a husband.
Absolutely. Now, to complicate this, and even more interesting too, is that at that time they're adopting children too, and tell us about the order of events, but they end up adopting a black child and Korean, I believe. So tell us about their adoption, and then before we talk about their own child that was born between them. Yeah,
they adopted a few children, and they took in an older woman, and then they had Stephen Jones, a child of their own, and they really he started selling monkeys. I mean, he was doing all kinds of stuff. It was a pretty interesting time, but again, we don't know too much about that time other than really what Tim Reiteman wrote about, and he did obviously extensive research on his on Jim's younger days, so that's kind of where a lot of that comes from.
Sorry, did you mention about Ronnie Baldwin too? His wife's his brother. Tell us about Ronnie Baldwin and them bringing him into the family.
Yeah, I mean, Ronnie, that was another one where I think that was one of the people who he tried to manipulate, and I think that was his first like defector, really, who he tried to manipulate and say that his, the mother didn't love him, and the child wound up leaving him after a certain amount of time because there was a lot of mental abuse that Ronnie went through. And Marceline, I think this is where she first, witnessed, how sadistic Jim could be with other people. He really, he was not nice to Ronnie, in a lot of ways, and that relationship wound up ending pretty badly. And thankfully for Ronnie, I mean, he was, one of the. Don was the first person to defect. Donald Friedman, but Ronnie was the second, and both were lucky to get away from him.
Now, you talk about Jim's epiphany in 1952 at the Somerset Methodist Church. Tell us what happens at this church and what announcement he makes in terms of his new career move.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, he sees a credo which, really wants to incorporate all types of people, and he gets very, very excited, and it was also he was able to talk about his social views, his ideologies, and it really always was to Jim about being able to talk about his political views. I mean, it was never really about religion for him. It was his able to push his political agenda. And so that's one thing, if you really, get into researching Jim Jones, you'll find that, he really was deep down an atheist. And he really just took on religion as a way to mask, for a reason to talk about his political views. And that's what he did. That's the way he was able to gain such political favor later in life with all the major politicians, including, like I said, the president's wife, Mrs. Ford at that time.
Right. And you say too that he liked the Methodist creed itself for its social goals. It met his social goals, and he just mixed it with the sort of the wild Pentecostal style of preaching and try to fuse those two things together. And part of it was what he had seen too was the healings were very powerful. You could heal somebody at these, at these
right.
meetings. So.
Absolutely. That was the thing. It was he saw a way to, and that is exactly right. What he was able to do is, he kind of was he was forward thinking in that way, where he was ahead of his time. He was able to mesh these two styles and religions together, and the Pentecostal style of preaching, which was very upbeat and excited and engaging, and he was able to do that, and then mix in the healings as well, which were fake healings, but people believed them, and he did them so well with such great trickery that people were actually started to believe that this guy was a prophet. And I guess once he got a taste of that and that excitement from the crowd that they were feeling and pushing back towards him, he became addicted. And he knew at that point that, if he can continue this, not only can he build his congregation, but he can also get, these political leaders and also, more importantly, the religious community to back him, which that really in the beginning, it was what he needed. He needed top level, ministers to back him. And and that was his goal, and that's why he would go to these these huge seminars with thousands of people where all these preachers would speak, and he wanted to go in there like a rock star and just win over their congregations and go and win them over so he can go speak at their congregations and basically steal their members, and he did that very, very, very well.
Yes, you talk about that. His big debut on the big stage was in Detroit, 1953 at the Bethesda Missionary Temple in Detroit, and it was an interdenominational missionary seminar. And he said hundreds of Protestant ministers were gathered for the event, and Jones wasn't scheduled to speak, but a female organizer gave him the opportunity, and Jim pulled out all the stops. He was calling out names, prophesizing and healing illnesses, and he said he captivated the crowd with his character, and he managed to steal the show and impress somebody that was very important to him and the rest of his career, this Reverend Edwin Wilson. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. I mean, he was able to go up there and he was able to speak, and a lot of people were skeptical. I mean, he definitely, there were a lot of ministers who looked at this guy like, who's this guy think he is? but he didn't care. I mean, he was just looking to grab a couple people that were going to back him. I mean, that's all he was looking for. He didn't, and he did. And then he would take them with him, and he would just build from there. And then he'd go to another big seminar, and he would do the same thing. And eventually, he built such a following from doing this that he became a force to be reckoned with on his own.
Pretty soon, he leaves Somerset Methodist, gets a little bit of money, and he rents a little church, and he calls it the Community Unity. And it's in a racially mixed area, and so he has his own church here now, and he's getting known for healings and prophecies. And so tell us a little bit about the relationship, because we haven't spoken about, even in his childhood, his high school, the relationship, his sexual relationship with women, and his sexual orientation. Tell us just a little bit about, the importance of women and his allure or no allure with these women.
Well, he certainly had, allure with the women. But it's odd because if you read the book, if you do your research, you'll see that he could get these women on his own without having to humiliate them, but somehow I guess he got off on that. I mean, he really did. So he wanted to dominate them. He wanted to embarrass them. I mean, I'm sure you know what I'm speaking of with the couple of instances that were in the book with Debbie Layton later, and right. I don't want to get too far ahead, but he was obviously also a homosexual. He did sleep with men. And he openly said that even in PC meetings and to a lot of his members later, after he had already gained control over them. So yeah, I mean, he had a lot of issues, as far as the way he treated people. It wasn't that he was a homosexual; it was the way he treated just the people he was with. I mean, he'd humiliate them. I mean, without getting into too much great detail. I mean, in the book, it's all right there. It's very sadistic.
The other thing I find interesting is as soon as he gets sort of the support of somebody at a religious congregation, he is either trying to take their following or upstage them, and at the same time he knows that it's a racially mixed and charged area and time, and yet he does things like bringing black church members onto the stage of the church. So he is a real radical, and he's really burning bridges, it seems, but it's a part of his personality. He's not subtle, this guy.
No, he's certainly not subtle. And once he believed that he could, he had a foothold, or he had some power, he would certainly use that. He was somewhat subtle in certain ways, but when he first got into a couple of these churches, he was subtle. He would just preach. He would. He was a great preacher. He would show his charisma, and then suddenly he would start to push his agenda, his political agenda. He would start to, bring the black congregation into this white, congregation, and he'd mix them. And obviously, at that time, they felt very uncomfortable about that, and a lot of people left. So he didn't care. This is the way I'm going to do things, and if you don't like it, it's too bad, because he saw an opportunity here. He didn't think that he was burning bridges and he was going to go backwards, and he didn't. He kept going up and up with this thinking, and it was it was very forward thinking at the time. He was well ahead of his time in that area.
Now, you talk about him meeting, we can't go through all the people that he meets, but it's important that he meets this Jack Beam, and he starts understanding the importance of gaining financial support. And so, coincidentally, he starts gravitating towards people that might have something to contribute. So tell us a little bit about the formation of People's Temple and his relationship with Jack Beam.
Right. Well, he meets, he takes Jack from the last church that he was at, along with several other members. Jack becomes one of his really most staunch and loyal members for the rest of their lives, really. And yes, he starts to gravitate towards people who have money. The Myrtles had several properties, and basically his grand plan was to have everyone live communally, and then just donate all of their stuff, their properties, their money, their Social Security, their salaries, whatever they were getting, they had to donate a large portion, more than half, to the church. And so now the church has all this income. You are basically working for the church. And how he would keep this all together, through the long haul, was to have people sign documents that were blank, power of attorney documents that were blank. So then, he could manipulate them in any way later on if they wanted to leave, and then say, you signed this power of attorney, and you said that you sexually molested children, and he would just, like I said, that's how he knew he can gain a foothold over people. He had so many different tactics of how to keep people quiet and how to hold them in and how to keep, them bringing in money for him,
What was his philosophy? How did he really, what was the philosophy that he was conveying to these people in terms of the government, anti-government sentiment, in terms of the government was against them, they were oppressive to blacks, they were oppressive to people, and that's why they would want to go live communally somewhere else? What was some of the things that he incorporated and he said in that philosophy?
Well, I mean, he was really just talking about what was going on at that time, and it wasn't anything that was secretive. I mean, there were a lot of race. There were a lot of you had the civil rights movement. I mean, you had all this stuff going on. So this wasn't anything that he was telling them that was new news. I mean, he was just basically taking what was going on at that time and using it in his favor, telling them that he was not like that. He was going to build a community that was racially mixed, and this is going to be the new thing. This is going to be the way it is in the future, and we're going to show them how to live and the right way to live. And I mean, it's just he would just use that to his favor. It was sort of like a Martin Luther King, but the dyslexic psychotic version.
Now, where was the first People's Temple established? It's 1959, but where is this?
I don't even. You see, you've done more research, I think, than me on my book.
Well, I know he was in Indianapolis, and then I know he's in San Francisco. So I'm thinking.
It was San Francisco. It was on the Geary. It was on Geary Street. It was San Francisco. Then he was in Ukiah, and he was in Los Angeles.
Right.
Yeah. Some of the. Yeah.
But
yeah.
it's interesting.
It's interesting. Actually, I believe it was Ukiah. Ukiah was the first area of the People's Temple.
Okay. It's interesting. In '59, the temple has 2,000 members, and so we're entering into 1960, and he's talking about a person named Father Divine, the leader of the International Peace Mission movement, and this guy's. They're calling him the Dean of the Universe and even God himself. So tell us a little bit about Father Divine and Jim Jones.
Father Divine had, they were saying that he had somewhere around 1 million followers. At that time, he was a very popular black minister, and he was also rich. And he lived in a mansion, and he prophesied himself as the living God, and his followers believed him. And I think this is when Jim got wind of him, and then eventually went out and met him and saw his congregation, preached with him. He kind of got this idea that I can do this. I can do this with my people. And Father Divine's wife was not too happy with Jim Jones. I think she sensed that he, was trying to use Father Divine and manipulate him and use his tactics. And I think there was at one point he was, Father Divine kind of wanted Jim to take over when he was done, and Mother Divine she was not having it. And but Jim figured, I could take this back to my congregation, and that's what he did. He assumed many of the rules that Father Divine had, and he put those on his people, like no sex, between anyone in the congregation, and just there were a lot of rules that Father Divine had that he assumed for his congregation.
Right. And how does Jim get to the idea, or what happens with the progression of People's Temple from that point?
Well, from that point on, it becomes much more strict. It seems that there's a change, and members, see this change in Jim where he becomes much more authoritative and much more militant with his congregation, and a lot of people I think did not like it, but again he had this stronghold over them, and he wouldn't do this with the new members. With the new members would come in, and he would have his congregation he would have them seen as they just as normal. He would have them at his normal sessions, preaching, prophesizing. But then he would have other sessions where he would really start to talk to his other members, his staunch members, and they would see the real Jim Jones. And then once he got these other new recruits in, that's when he would show them who he really was.
In the book you have in 1961, his associate pastor, Archie Igems, Jim Jones tells him he hears voices from extraterrestrial beings, that he had a vision of a nuclear explosion in Chicago of apocalyptic proportions, and this is where he starts talking about moving the church to a safe zone to avoid nuclear fallout. So tell us a little bit what the fallout is from him talking like this.
Well, there that's where I start to kind of disassociate myself and veer off from the original version, where I believe that was just an excuse for him to I don't like to say, because I don't want to get too radical, and I don't want to push people in a direction of my I'd like the reader to figure it out for themselves or have their own opinion of it, but I don't believe that was the reason. I believe he was traveling to this CIA installation where Dan Mitrione had coincidentally where he was, and then there were people who saw him out there. He had a lot of money out there. Suddenly, didn't have a lot of money here. All of a sudden, he looked like he was rich out there, and there were always U.S. government cars in front of his house. I mean, there seemed to be a lot of fishy things going on. He had 2 passports, like he had a double. I mean, at that point, it kind of seemed like there was a lot of things happening where we can't explain, and that's where things get a little fishy and dicey.
Well, what do you assume, or what do you theorize happened in this? You talk about him moving to Hawaii, and you have good proof that he had, again, this money that doesn't seem to have any source of this income. Why Dan Mitrione, CIA, U.S. government, what do they know about Jim Jones, or what do they believe about Jim Jones, and why would they be interested in Jim Jones?
Well, obviously he had a pretty he had that charisma. He had a congregation. He was building it. Maybe they said, we'll help you build an even bigger congregation. We'll get you in with certain government agencies. I mean, all this is speculation. I can't really, I could theorize, anything I want. I mean, we could fill in the gaps here any way that we want with any type of philosophy, which, in my opinion, makes a lot of sense. It's very reasonable. But again, a lot of it's speculation. But there was something happening there, and there is evidence that there was something other than what the official version is. And I believe that, he was going to these places where there was actually a military bases there. So why would he look for safe havens near military bases? I mean, that doesn't really make much sense, right?
Right.
I mean, those areas would be hit first in nuclear fallout, right? So there's a lot of things that don't make sense in his scenario of trying to travel, and it just didn't make sense to me.
You have it in 1961. Jones disappears from the public record for about 6 months, and this is after traveling to Guyana. And so tell us what happens after that 6 months after he emerges, and what is it about Guyana and its political state that would be of interest to Jim Jones?
Well, they would certainly back him. It was definitely isolated, very isolated. No one would be able to get in and out without his say. He was able to build this beautiful community that would house his people, and it was a perfect place for him to isolate these people and get their news strictly from him. They weren't able to get any outside news. It was Jim Jones was your CNN. He was in total control, and that's what he wanted.
Now tell us, just for this background, because we intimated it and we spoke about it in the synopsis about the MKULTRA experiment. So briefly, tell us what you know and what you found out about the MKULTRA experiments from CIA.
Yeah, I mean, MKULTRA is pretty widely known. They had Senate hearings in 76 and 77. Ted Kennedy's. They had the Senate hearings, the Health Committee, and they basically were doing experiments. So many different kinds. I mean, there's books about it, but basically they were doing. They stole a lot of techniques from the Germans, the United States. They took a lot of their scientists, after Nuremberg, and they went and they developed a lot of the torture techniques and things that they were doing in Germany, and U.S. wound up developing them further, and putting them under an umbrella of different experiments, and then kind of trimming them down into sub projects, and then they did a lot of stuff. I could give you an example. They had safe houses in New York and San Francisco, and CIA agents would have prostitutes lure gentlemen back, and then they would stand behind a glass, like a glass wall or a glass door, and they would secretly administer them with LSD, and then I guess they would do experiments on them. I mean, these are well documented. There was just so many things that happened, and the CIA would also put money under fake corporations to universities, like Georgetown University was used, and this was all in the paper. I mean, this was widely known, and it came out at the time during those Senate hearings. So, I mean, if you don't know anything about MKUltra, anyone out there, I mean, it's certainly part of U.S. history that you want to familiarize yourself with, because it did happen.
The other fascinating fact that you uncovered, too, is that he had a Cuban visa and met Fidel Castro after some anti-communist speeches. So tell us what that might mean. Again, we're already talking about what it means, but the significance.
Right. I mean, the first, I guess, thing you'd want to do is if you were teaming up with someone who you didn't want anybody to know you were teaming up with, would be to talk against them, right? I mean, or vice. I don't know what he was trying to do as far as with Fidel Castro or any of these people. I mean, honestly, there's just really no way to know. But there is evidence, that he, that he was talking to CIA people. He knew a lot of CIA people. We know Jim Jones did, especially in Guyana. So we just don't know where those links led to, how deep that rabbit hole went. We just don't know, unfortunately, because his the FBI and CIA, they purged his records right after. They had a big file on him that was completely purged right after he died. Unfortunately, we'll never really know to what extent that and how far this really went.
The other fascinating aspect of this person's character, and it's important to be able to understand the true scope of who he was and what he became, is the revelation that with his wife's, I guess, permission, women were paying $5,000 for Jones' sexual services. So apparently
right.
He's a very... anyway, tell us a little bit about what you found about his gigolo days.
Well, that was just him, what he had proclaimed. So we don't, I mean, obviously that might have been an exaggeration. I mean, Marceline, she did say that stuff did happen, but who knows? Maybe that was just what he was saying and wanted her to say so that he can manipulate people further.
But it might seem to make sense when you have a certain hold on people when they're giving up their property and not sleeping with their spouse and all the things that we'll talk about in the future. So there might be some credence to it, as unrealistic.
There absolutely might be. Yeah, there absolutely might be. Unfortunately, it came straight from Jim's mouth, and there were
Sure.
he didn't really identify and we didn't hear what the other person. Their story. So, and then again, you had, like I said, we have Debbie Layton's story, which, she tells a couple stories in her book, and I chronicle, one of the stories that she told about, Jim saying that she was begging him for sex, and we know that wasn't true. So, I think we're safe to assume that he was probably at least skewing the facts there. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Now, let's talk about this Dan Mitrione again. When Jim meets him at 16 years of age, and Mitrione takes him under his wing, and now who does Mitrione become, and what does he get involved with in terms of the CIA and torture? And so tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, he becomes one of the major CIA torturers in history. And again, if you don't know anything about him, definitely look him up. And there is a movie that is out about his life that you definitely want to check out. It was a major motion picture back in the day. So you'll be able to really get into what he was about and what his life was about. Unfortunately, Jim Jones was not. His character was not featured in that movie, but or in the movie in any way. But you'll be able to really get a good look at what type of person Mitrione was, and what he did for the CIA, which there were not many nice things.
So the old connection with Mitrione and Brazil, and again former Nazis and CIA and Jim Jones and his family being there. Tell us now about the establishment of People's Temple in San Francisco, and tell us a little bit about that.
Well, yeah, I mean, in San Francisco was a great area for him because, the hippies were down there. There were a lot of people looking for, a savior, looking for, some anti-establishment. That's totally what it was down there in San Francisco at that time. So in the Haight-Ashbury section. So it was a perfect place for him to build this community and get these hippie Hare Krishna type following, as well as getting together a congregation of the locals who were working class people. So he was able to get just about every type of people that were down there, group of people, and get them together and get them to rally behind him. So it wound up being a real perfect area for him. I think it wound up being the best area and became that home hub for him. Even though he did operate. I mean, they would take bus rides all over the place. Atlanta. They would go all over to try to recruit people, but that kind of became his hub. And his place that he really, really settled in as home.
Now, you, in the book, interestingly, you talk about detour a little bit and go back to a woman named Debbie Layton and how she gets introduced to Jim Jones through her brother, Larry, who had joined the People's Temple and thinking that he was doing humanitarian work. So there's a reason why Debbie Layton is introduced, but tell us about Debbie Layton and how she is convinced with her, some of the stuff that her brother Larry tells her about, and tell us about this fascinating character.
Debbie Layton has a book, and Jeannie Mills has a book as well. And to me, you can't talk about the story without talking about these two, because they play a quintessential role in the rise and fall, particularly the fall of Jim Jones, and they also are able to really get, they help you see a side of Jones that you wouldn't see otherwise. So Debbie, got in through her brother Larry, and she was kind of a troubled child. She didn't really have a direction. She wound up meeting Jim. She felt just like, I guess, everyone else who joined, wound up feeling at home, and she joined and she became a staunch member. And then she wound up in Jonestown, and when she got to Jonestown, she really saw, I guess, just like everyone else, that it wasn't what they thought it would be, and most people wanted to leave almost right away.
Well, let's not just jump ahead quite yet. Let's talk a little bit about how Jim gets to basically have he does this incredible favor for Larry. Larry's a war objector. He writes a letter to not have to go to the war. Larry is so enamored by him, he tells his sister Debbie about this People's Temple. This is kind of in the beginning how he builds this really allegiance of a core group of people that will do anything for him.
Right.
So it's about those early days in People's Temple, before they get the idea that they should go to Guyana, before they get the property itself, and before they has the rationale that they want to get the hell out of the U.S.
Well, I mean, Jim was pumping these ideas into their head pretty early on. I mean, they got this property years before. Jim had, I believe Jim had got the property, really started this process back in 1974. Maybe even a little before that, but in '74 was officially that he started heading his congregation this way. I guess, hinting it at first, and then eventually, this was what they were all gearing towards. But yeah, I mean, this was the objective. I mean, this was what he was selling. Let's live communally, and we can't live communally in here. I mean, we can't bring all these people and put where we're gonna put. We need to build our own facility. And it was this thinking, oh, it's gonna be heaven, it's gonna be beautiful. And then once the first settlers of Jonestown were there. They would send video back of how gorgeous it was, and these propaganda videos. So I mean, this was in the works, and Jim's idea for many years. It didn't just happen overnight. Did he get? Was it just his idea? I mean, was this some type of nefarious idea that he had? With, like I said, other people involved, such as government agencies. Again, we could speculate, but
he had a way too with the philosophy that he learned from Father Divine there, that the idea that even couples that would come into the congregation wouldn't be allowed to have sex with each other. And you include a story where he actually says, "Listen, I can see that you people really aren't right for each other," and they oddly marry other people in that congregation and hook up, and he's sort of the matchmaker in there. But shows you the manipulation that he is learning rapidly.
Right. It was divide and conquer. I mean, that was his major, I believe, philosophy, and you could see this in many different areas. It was a divide and conquer philosophy. It was, he would pit brother against brother, sister against brother, mother against son. If later on in Jonestown, you really see this happening where he would test people. He would send a father to his son and say, "Listen, I'm thinking about, leaving. I'm thinking about escaping." And then if that son did not tell the authorities, that son would then be, scolded, put in isolation. So he really learned to do, in doing that, he made people not trust each other, therefore dividing everyone. You know what I mean? So you couldn't trust your best friend because you didn't know if he was tricking you or not. Well, he was sent from Jones himself.
It's fascinating, too, that you talk about Larry and Caroline. He splits up that couple, but then Caroline becomes his confidant. He says he's not having sex with Marceline, so he starts having sex with Caroline. Again, it's ironic that he forbade sex between couples. And then I guess that's part of why he might have looked at Debbie as being quite special. And in that, when he looks at Debbie as quite special, how far does he go, and what does the kind of things that he says to her to convince her to come along into this People's Temple?
Well, with Debbie, I think she was at a vulnerable stage in her life, and she was really looking for, to do something. She was kind of the black sheep in the family. Everybody else in the family, where they were her brothers and sisters were doing things. They had great careers. I mean, they were doing great things, and the parents would looked up to them, and they looked down on Debbie. So really, I think she was looking to do something, and she saw what Larry was doing, this humanitarian work, and I guess she felt, this may be her calling. Now, after she initially met Jones, she went back to school and was she was doing something else for like a year or so, and he just kept. Again, we see more foreshadowing. He kept sending her letters. He went on this great letter writing campaign to her, showing that he never forgot about her, that she could be an integral part of the church, that she, just making her feel like they needed her. And that's, at that point, I guess, with no other direction, and you got this powerful man telling you, of this large organization that they need you. I'm sure that pushed her over the edge, and drew her in pretty hard.
He matches her up as well with a couple devout temple members, which are Tim and Grace Stone, and she stays at their home. So again, further convincing her how great and wonderful Jim Jones is. Caroline, again, we didn't mention, Caroline actually believes Jim Jones is the reincarnation of Jesus, doesn't she?
She does, and as well as many other members do, yes, absolutely. And Caroline actually becomes Carolyn becomes his, in effect, he says later on, the only woman he truly, the love of his life. So, she wound up being his at a top level person, really the next in charge next to him.
To demonstrate the level of success that Jones is having in his People's Temple, by 72, he's holding and running several properties, you say, and they have this Christian Science church building in Los Angeles, San Francisco's People's Temple, and a temple in Ukiah, and which you say has a 40-foot indoor swimming pool, a 40-acre children's home, 3 convalescent centers, and 3 college dormitories. They also run a heroin rehabilitation center and what they're calling their own welfare system. So he's and the temple's getting big, and they are doing those kinds of things in the community, giving back to the community, which is convincing more and more members, isn't it?
Oh yeah, of course, and not just members. I mean, other people are seeing this. Political leaders are seeing all this work that's being done. I mean, how could you overlook that? What this guy's able to accomplish. These are huge accomplishments for back in that time. So again, you can see how he starts to really win over public opinion. I mean, they also, they have they get their own printing press at some point. They're putting out a magazine or a newspaper. I mean, they're really, really expanding and spreading their wings, more than any other establishment like them is doing. And they start to become, very far-reaching for that time.
It's interesting right at this time, though, that he gets so, I guess, narcissism takes over, and they're making claims that he has raised a Los Angeles man from the dead. Now, this raises the media is interested, and they're ready to publish a bunch of articles, but very much like reminiscent of Scientology and its campaign to silence critics. Tell us about what People's Temple does to silence critics.
Well, yeah, I mean, they use a lot of threats. Again, they use that letter writing campaigns. They have several different tactics to do so. And you got to remember this. This was a time before Twitter and Facebook and mass media. I mean, we really didn't have anything like that. So, when somebody's raising someone from the dead, and you hear about this, I mean, it becomes almost like this mythological thing that is spread around. And unfortunately, like I said, you don't have that first-hand view, so you're hearing second, third, fourth-hand views of things, and it becomes legendary.
Part of the manipulation, he says, is that if they, again, it seems reminiscent of Scientology as well, too, is that they said if you ever were to leave the church, you would be reincarnated as like a slug and take you 100,000 years to get back to where you were in terms of progressing. So all kinds of discouragement for leaving the church, and we'll see how far he goes with that idea. Right. Yeah. I mean, so that's one of many little techniques that Jones has to keep his people in mind. I mean, he has so many at this point, and he'll use anything. He'll say anything. I mean, it's outrageous. Well, we have had Will Savive just drop off our conversation. We will let him come back. I guess you'll have to call back in, and we'll continue our conversation about Jonestown. Don't drink the Kool-Aid. Very interesting. We're just about to talk about Jim Jones and his plans, the actual plans that he puts forward with his followers to make the exodus to Guyana, South America, and build the People's Temple compound called Jonestown in Guyana, in the remote jungles of Guyana, South America. And as Will has alluded to, there are powerful people, including Rosalind Carter, Harvey Milk, congressman in San Francisco, and other political and important political allies, that are looking at Jim Jones' experiment with, and looking at it optimistically, that it's something that they can learn from, and looking to Jim Jones as a benevolent leader, doing good socially addressing social issues, and so that there was something to look at and admire in the Jonestown experiment, and in the People's Temple itself, and the things we were trying to achieve. Now, Will has dropped off, so we will give this about 5 minutes. Again, we would be going about probably well over the hour and a half mark of the program, which I'd like to keep it to about an hour and a half. This is we've taken this long to get to this point, but things rapidly, again, we'll say deteriorate, is not an appropriate term, but in getting involved with Congressman Leo Ryan and the U.S. government eventually investigating claims of some People's Temple members that are not happy with this Jim Jones utopia. And so this book, like I say, you have to get the groundwork for the history behind this incredible time, the context, the history, everything that we've laid out to be able to fully understand what happens at Jonestown, why, and some of the connections that Will has made with the Dan Mitrione, the CIA, the MKUltra experiments in mind control. It's a very, very fascinating time in American history, and Jonestown and Jim Jones are part of that, a very fascinating story at that time in history, and again, becoming one of the most important moments in history, the Jonestown murders, mass suicide, and the murders of congressmen and some of his other people that were involved in going over to Jonestown for the investigation and media interviews. So it looks like Will Savive might not reconnect, so I will use this as an opportunity to please take a look at his book, Jonestown, Don't Drink the Kool-Aid, the complete story behind the mysterious Jim Jones and his exodus to Guyana. Thank you very much. Have a great evening.